Night, Chapter 14. There was a woman with us, a certain Mrs. Shader. She was in her 50s, and her 10-year-old son was with her, sitting in a corner. Her husband and 2 older sons had been deported with the first transport by mistake. The separation had totally shattered her. I knew her well, a quiet woman with intelligent eyes. She had been a frequent guest in our house. Her husband was a religious man who spent most of his days and nights studying the Talmud. Miss Shader had lost her mind. She had gone mad. On the first day of the journey, she had already begun to moan. She kept asking why she had been separated from her family. Later, her sobbing and screaming became intolerable. On the 3rd night, as we were sleeping, some of us sitting, some of us standing, a terrifying cry broke the silence. "Fire! I see a fire! I see a fire!" There was a moment of fear. Who had screamed? It was Mrs. Shader. Standing in the middle of the car, in the little light that had come through the windows, she looked like a dead tree in a field. She was screaming, pointing through the window. "Look! Look at this fire! This terrible fire!" She moved toward the bars to see. There was nothing, only the darkness of night. It took us a long time to recover from this terrifying awakening. We were still scared. Unable to escape our anguish, we tried to make each other feel better. "She is mad, poor woman." Someone had put a wet rag on her forehead, but she nevertheless continued to scream, "Fire! I see a fire!" Her little boy had been crying, holding her skirt, trying to hold her hand. "It's nothing, Mother. There's nothing there. Please sit down." His words gave me more despair than did his mother's cries. Some of the women tried to calm her. "You'll see, you'll find your husband and sons again in a few days." She continued to scream and sob uncontrollably. "Jews, listen to me," she cried. "I see a fire, a tremendous fire." It was like she were taken over by some evil spirit. We tried to calm her down, more to calm ourselves than to calm her. "She is hallucinating because she is thirsty. Poor woman. That's why she speaks of fire." But it was all in vain. Our fear could no longer be calmed. Our nerves had reached a breaking point. It was as though madness had infected all of us. We gave up. A few young men forced her to sit down, then tied her hands behind her back and covered her mouth with a rag. Silence fell again. The small boy next to his mother crying. I started to breathe normally again as I listened to the wheels on the tracks of the train race through the night. We could begin to doze again, to rest, to dream. And so an hour or 2 passed. Another scream surprised us. The woman had broken free and was screaming louder than before. "Look at the fire! Look at the fire! Fire everywhere!" Once again, the young men tied her and covered her mouth. When they actually hit her, people shouted their encouragement. "Keep her quiet! Make that mad woman shut up! She's not the only one here." She received several hits to the head, hits that could have been lethal. Her son was holding desperately to her, not saying a word. He was no longer crying. The night seemed endless. By day, Mrs. Shader had settled down. In her corner, her empty eyes looked toward some faraway place. She no longer saw us. She remained like that all day, not speaking, alone in the middle of us all. Toward evening, she began to scream again. "The fire! Over there!" She was pointing somewhere in the distance, always the same place. No one felt like hitting her anymore. The heat, the thirst, the smell, the lack of air were making us too tired. Yet all that was nothing compared to her screams, which terrified us. A few more days and all of us would have started to scream. But we were pulling into a station. Someone near a window read to us Auschwitz. Nobody had ever heard that name. Chapter 15. The train did not move again. The afternoon went by slowly. Then the doors to the cattle car opened. 2 men were given permission to get water. When they came back, they told us that they had learned in exchange for a gold watch. That was the final destination. We were to leave the train. There was a labor camp on the site. They said that the conditions were good and that families would not be separated. Only the young would work in the factories. The old and the sick would find work in the fields. Confidence soared. Suddenly, we felt free of the previous night's terror. We gave thanks to God. Mrs. Shader remained sitting in her corner, not speaking. Her little son was touching her hand. Dusk began to fill the cattle car. We ate what was left of our food. At 10 o'clock in the evening, we were all trying to find a position for a quick nap, and soon we were sleeping. Suddenly, "Look at the fire over there!" With a start, we awoke and rushed to the window yet again. We had believed her, if only for a moment, but there was nothing outside but darkness. We returned to our place with fear eating our souls. As she went on screaming, she was hit again. Only with great difficulty did we succeed in keeping her quiet. The man in charge of our cattle car called out to a German officer walking down the platform, asking him to have the mad woman moved to a hospital car. "Patience," the German replied. Patience. She'll be taken there soon." Around 11 o'clock, the train began to move again. We pressed against the windows. The cattle cars were rolling slowly. A quarter of an hour later, it began to slow down even more. Through the windows, we saw barbed wire. We understood that this was the labor camp. We had forgotten Miss Shader's existence. Suddenly, there was a terrible scream. "Jews, look at the fire, look at the fire." And as the train stopped, this time, we did see a tremendous fire rising into a black sky. Miss Shader became silent on her own. She had returned to her corner. We stared at the fire in the darkness. A horrible smell was in the air. Suddenly, our doors opened. Strange-looking people dressed in striped jackets and black pants jumped into the cattle car. Holding lights and sticks, they began to hit us, shouting, "Everybody out! Leave everything inside! Hurry up!" We jumped out. I looked at Mrs. Shader. Her little boy was still holding her. In front of us, that fire. In the air, the smell of burning flesh. It must have been around midnight. We had arrived in Birkenau. Chapter 16. The objects that we had carried with us from place to place were now left behind in the cattle car, and with them, finally, our illusions. Every few yards there stood a Nazi soldier, his machine gun trained on us. We followed the group. A Nazi soldier came toward us holding a club. He screamed, "Men to the left, women to the right." 8 words spoken callously, without emotion. 8 simple, short words. Yet that was the moment when I left my mother. There was no time to think. I had already felt my father's hand press against mine. We were alone. In a fraction of a second, I could see my mother and my sisters move to the right. Tisbora was holding my mother's hands. I saw them walking further and further away. Mother was touching my sister's blonde hair as if to protect her. And I walked on with my father, with the men I didn't know. I didn't know that this was the moment and the place where I was leaving my mother and Tisbora forever. I kept walking, my father holding my hand. Behind me, an old man fell to the ground. Nearby, a Nazi put his gun in his hand. I held my father's hand tightly. All I could think of was not to lose him, not to remain alone. The SS officer gave the order, "Form groups of 5. There was chaos. It was important to stay together. "Hey kid, how old are you?" The man interviewing me was a prisoner. I could not see his face, but his voice was both afraid and warm. 15. "No, you're not. You're 18. "But I'm not," I said. "I'm 15. "Fool, listen to what I say." Then he asked my father, who answered, "I'm 50. "No," the man now sounded angry. "Not 50, you're 40. Do you hear? 18 and 40. He disappeared into the darkness. Another prisoner appeared, screaming, "Sons of bitches, why have you come here? Tell me why." Someone dared to reply, "What do you think, that we came here because we wanted to? That we asked to come here?" The other seemed ready to kill him. "Shut up, stupid, or I'll tear you to pieces. You should have killed yourselves rather than come here. Didn't you know that what was here in Auschwitz? You didn't know? In 1944? "True. We didn't know." Nobody had told us. We couldn't believe his ears. His mood became even angrier. Over there. Do you see the chimney over there? Do you see it? And the fire? Do you see it? Yes, we saw the fire. Over there. That's where they'll take you. Over there will be your tomb. You still don't understand, you sons of bitches? Don't you understand anything? You will be burned. Burned to ashes. Burned into ashes. His anger changed into a fury. We stood terrified. Could this be just a nightmare, a horrible nightmare? I heard whispers around me. We must do something. We can't let them kill us like that, like animals. We must rebel. There were among us a few strong young men. They actually had knives and were encouraging us to attack the soldiers. One of them was saying, "Let the world learn about the existence of Auschwitz. Let everybody find out about it while they still have a chance to escape." But the older men asked their sons not to do anything. We mustn't give up hope, even now as the knife hangs over our heads. The talk of rebellion stopped. We continued to walk until we came to a road. Standing in the middle of it, though I didn't know it then, Dr. Meengle, the horrible Dr. Meengle. He looked like the typical Nazi, a cruel, strong, intelligent face. He was holding a club and was surrounded by soldiers. The club was moving, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left. Suddenly, I stood before him. "Your age?" he asked. "I'm 18. I was terrified. "In good health?" "Yes." "Your profession?" Tell him that I was a student? "Farmer," I heard myself saying. This conversation lasted no more than a few seconds. It seemed like a lifetime. The club pointed to the left. I took half a step forward. I first wanted to see where they would send my father. Were he to have gone to the right, I would have to run after him. The club once more moved to the left. A weight lifted from my heart. We did not know as yet which was the better side, right or left, which road led to prison and which to the crematorium. Still, I was happy. I was near my father. Our group continued slowly to move forward. Another prisoner came over to us. "Satisfied?" "Yes," someone answered. "Poor devils, you are heading for the crematorium." He seemed to be telling the truth. Not far from us, a tremendous fire, was rising from the hole in the ground. Something was being burned there. A truck drew close and stopped. Small children were carried out. Babies! Yes, I did see this, with my own eyes. Children thrown into the fire. This is why ever since then, sleep is difficult for me. So that was where we are going. A little further on, there was another, larger hole for adults. I hit myself. Was I still alive? Was I awake? How was it possible that men, women, and children were being burned and the world kept silent? No, all this could not be real. A nightmare, maybe. Soon I would wake up and find that I was back in the room of my childhood with my books. My father's voice surprised me. "You should have gone with your mother. I saw many children your age go with their mothers." His voice was tremendously sad. I understood that he did not wish to see what they would do to me. He did not wish to see his only son burn in the fire. My forehead was covered with cold sweat. Still, I told him that I could not believe that human beings were being burned in our times. The world would never tolerate such evil. The world is not interested in us. Today, everything is possible, even the crematorium. His voice went silent. "Father," I said, "if that is true, then I don't want to wait. I'll run into the electrified barbed wire. That would be easier than a slow death in the fire." He didn't answer. He was weeping. His body was shaking. Everybody around us was weeping. Someone began to say the prayer for the dead. I don't know whether during the history of the Jewish people, men have ever said before the prayer for the dead for themselves. Yisgadal Vigadash Shimba Rabba. May his name be celebrated, whispered my father. For the first time I felt anger rising with me. Why should I pray this way? God was choosing to be silent. What was there to thank him for? We continued our march. We were coming closer and closer to